Hello and welcome back. Thank you for tuning in to another Vice News live stream. As always, I'm your host, Lee Adams, and today I am joined by Danielle Cadet, the managing editor of Unbothered at Refinery 29. Danielle, welcome back to the stream.
Hey, Lee, it's good to be back. I'm excited I feel like our conversations are always really great, so I'm excited for another one.
I'm just happy to have you here to bounce ideas off you. We've been at it for a few weeks now. We've had a lot of really interesting conversations. It started with President Obama and his, advice that, while we are demonstrating and protesting is important, that voting is really what is going to be the key follow through for a lot of these conversations that have started. Conversations about defunding the police and, reform in society from an equality and social justice standpoint. And so that follow through is going to look like voting. It's going to mean getting out to the polls. And in this moment, we're seeing voter suppression, particularly in states like Kentucky, being rolled out and being confronted yet again. What has been your perspective of voter suppression, what it looks like right now in this moment, and how important voting is going to be in sort of pushing these conversations forward into policy?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think voter suppression is it's an incredibly important topic right now because it is a very dangerous tactic. And it is one that, quite frankly, has, been in use in this country for a very long time. And, I think obviously with the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1965, we did feel like we made some major strides to get past these efforts to suppress the vote, right? But even since then, we've seen sort of a lot of those efforts being pushed back. And it's incredibly scary because, as to your point, as former President Obama said, voting is going to be such a huge part of moving this movement forward, right? Of starting with protest and making noise and making sure that people are aware of what the issues are, but now taking it to the next step and getting out to the polls. Particularly in places like Kentucky, we saw this week that in cities like Louisville, which has the state's largest concentration of Black voters, we saw that the city went from having a number of voting locations to, I believe, only one, and that's it's a really terrifying and problematic thing there when you're talking about, I believe the numbers were somewhere around 300,000 voters that were all supposed to go to one location. And so, when you think about situations like the Breonna Taylor shooting, which, folks are still very upset that there have been no arrests made and that there's only been one officer fired. And we have to think about what's happening on the local level in order to sort of affect real change like that. And so voter suppression is certainly something we've got to pay lots of attention to, because although we have access to polling information and we are getting a lot of information about how Americans feel right now, and we feel like we have this sense of how people are going to vote, what we don't understand is the way that the strategy of voter suppression actually enacts, and the fact that regardless of what people's opinions are, if they can't get to the polls, they won't be able to actually change things. I spoke about this before when we talked about Juneteenth. It's really fantastic that we've been given Juneteenth as a day off, or that a lot of brands and companies acknowledge Juneteenth this year as a holiday. But we really need to be thinking about Election Day as a holiday. We really need to be thinking about folks having access to be able to get to the polls. If you can't, one of the things we saw in Kentucky was the traffic to this polling location was horrific. And if you can't make it to your polling place before it closes, or if you're stuck in traffic because you're going after work, these are things that we really need to give some serious thought to as the movement moves forward.
And when we think about voter suppression, it's this umbrella term that refers to a lot of different things. So it refers to the hours that a polling location is open and whether or not people are even able to take off work, whether or not they'll be able to keep their job. In certain cases, they won't if they decide they're going to go vote that day. We're talking about voter ID laws, right? And how you need to have ID present in order to vote. We're talking about scaling back mail-in voting in certain states or in certain locales. We're also talking about redlining, right? Which is the system that was utilized in America to refuse housing access to certain groups of people in this country. We're talking about gerrymandering and the redrawing of congressional districts. Tell me a little bit about how these things have come to shape American democracy and how they really are the antithesis of what we are supposed to have built this country on, which is the ability to hold our electeds and our government accountable via our civic duty and the right to vote.
100%. Absolutely. I mean, I think what we find is that it kind of muddies the waters, right? Is that we believe as Americans and as, participants in a functioning democracy, that your vote is supposed to be able, you're supposed to go out and be able to cast your vote and affect real change and be able to have, influence on what is happening, not only at the local level but also at the national level. I'm going to add to that, in that all of those things that you listed as far as voter suppression. It's such a wide swath, but it also is the reason why a lot of voters take issue with the electoral college in this country,
Right.
because it is not just black and white in that you go to your polling place and you cast your vote and you're able to affect change. There are so many, strategic sort of breakdowns, and there's so much red tape really that comes with that. And that is oftentimes how elections are won. We've seen, time and time again in this country, that just because you have the majority of the vote, we've seen this very recently, we've seen this within, the last decade, that, just because you have the majority of the vote does not mean that you win the national election. And, we often find that, as we're watching votes come in, as we're watching different districts vote, I think politicians are very strategic about where they know that the majority of their voting base is, and how they make sure to either maintain that, or if they know that they have to, redistrict in order to make sure that they do get a majority of a different district. And that can get really dangerous, and that can get very scary. And I do think that, that's oftentimes why, particularly young voters become so exhausted with the system, because you are told that if you cast your vote and if you participate, in this function of democracy, that you will be able to affect change in this country. And the reality is that, that can be way more complicated than any of us think. If we're getting even more granular, we have to think about the fact that some judges have lifetime appointments. And so to a
Right.
certain extent, even if we're able to, unseat incumbents, there are still members of, the judicial system that are, when we're not even just talking about the Supreme Court, we're talking about at a local level, that are never going to sit on those seats until they die. So, I think it's really thinking about voter suppression and the way that it enacts and the way that it can be carried out, the strategy behind it, and how it can affect not only the vote, but the laws that are put in place as a result, is truly one of the most important parts of this fight, for us to really understand that in order to really enact real change.
And I think it's important to note that this is not just an issue of race, it is also an issue of class. It is an
Yes.
issue of whether you are, able to live in a city versus whether you live in a more rural setting where you have to travel further. Well, then you need a car just to get to your polling location, right?
Right.
Whether you are a citizen or whether you're not, right? Like whether you have been incarcerated and you have served your
Yeah.
time, and whether or not, and whether, when you come out, whether you can exercise your right to vote now that you're living among society again. So, voter suppression applies to all of those things. It applies to
Absolutely.
everyone in this country at a much more broad level than a lot of us think. Even when you think about college campuses, there have been college campuses in this country that have been redistricted in such a way that the campuses were split in down the middle, just to dilute the amount of voting potential that these young people on certain college campuses have. So, if we're going to think about, go ahead.
No, I mean, that's insane, because you made me aware of that. I wasn't aware of that before, and I want to add to that. I mean, we've got to also understand that the current pandemic is also going to play a role in this, right?
Right.
To your point about like being able to mail in vote, or to vote absentee ballots. There's so much discussion about voter fraud. There are so many states that do a lot of fear mongering in terms of saying that, millions of Americans are participating in voter fraud. And there are going to be a lot of folks who are going to be afraid to vote in person. There are a lot of folks who, as we well know, coronavirus has disproportionately affected Black communities. And so there are folks who
Hmm.
might have pre-existing conditions who may not either who not only might not be able to get to their voting location, they might be too afraid because they have asthma or they have, hypertension, and they don't know, they don't want to potentially expose themselves. And so we're going to see that coronavirus is also going to play a really large role in how we vote and how comfortable we feel voting, because so many people are going to be afraid to go to polling places as a result. And so these are the kinds of things as a country that we need to be thinking about. How are we making sure that people feel not only have access, but also feel safe when they vote?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, like, I have no comorbidities. I don't even have allergies, but I can't afford to not be at work right now. I can't afford to get sick. So, in myself in particular, this is an internal monologue that I'm having, even on my end, just thinking about, I know I have a responsibility to vote, but I'm also concerned with my health when it comes to exercising that civic duty. And as we think about voting and we think about the rhetoric of our politicians and talking about wanting to be tough on crime and how this is going to directly impact police reform in this country, when we think about, county sheriffs are elected officials, right? And city councils determine police chiefs in their cities. So what is your reaction to thinking about how police reform is going to look, what it's going to look like, and how it'll be implemented via voting in this next election cycle?
I think there's a lot that remains to be seen. I mean, coming off of this conversation about voter suppression, I do think, again, we will see likely a disconnect between what we're seeing in polling and what the turns out in voting, right? And not because people are necessarily lying when they're polling. It might just because those same people are not able to get to their polling places or able to exercise their vote in that same way. We recently saw that President Trump really doubled down on this idea of not wanting to fund the police and reinforcing this rhetoric that's really rooted in racism, this idea of being tough on crime, this idea of this war on crime rhetoric is rhetoric that is rooted in this idea that crime is committed by Black people. And, this is
Right.
the exact kind of racist rhetoric that we are trying to walk back and that we are trying to dismantle in this current moment. We're finally having this conversation about being anti-racist. It's not good enough to just say, I'm not a racist. You have to be
Right.
anti-racist. But what we're seeing now in this conversation about defunding the police, and we're now seeing, kind of this more of a push to reform the police, right? But that goes against this entire idea of being anti-racist, because this idea of being tough on crime to a certain extent means being tough on Black people and policing Black bodies, which is exactly how this whole conversation started in the first place. This is how we got here. This is how we got
Right.
to horrific videos like that of George Floyd or Ahmaud Arbery, or the most recent horrific situation with Elijah McClain that actually happened last August, but that we're now seeing video of. We got here because we were, again, going back to this idea of fear mongering. As a society, we were told that if we defund the police, then there will be abject chaos and there will be crime, and the streets will be ridden with criminals. And if we decode that, what's being said is the streets will be run by Black people who are intrinsically criminals, and so we're
Right.
seeing that same kind of rhetoric from President Trump. And we're seeing him really double down and say, because he is pandering to an audience, and to a voter base that does not want that, right? That is
Right.
afraid of that. And so, I think it is, I think what we'll see, and I hope what we'll see is, I hope that we'll combat voter suppression in order to really make some moves as far as defunding the police. Because if the folks who want to see the police get defunded can't make it to the polls, then we won't see that change.
Right. And it's also interesting to note that history has been an indicator that more police doesn't necessarily equal more safety, right? And New York City is now one of, I think, if not the safest big city in America. Crime has been on the slow downturn, and that was after we got rid of broken window policing and stop and frisk and all of those sorts of
Yes.
policies that were actually trampling on people's rights as opposed to making them more safe in their own neighborhoods. And I'm
Yes.
curious, what is your perspective when it comes to defunding the
Yes.
police? Because I think there is a real, I think when people hear that, they think, okay, we're just going to,
Yes.
no more cops, right? No more uniformed officers, get them out of here. Obviously, that's not the case. Can you walk us through how this is going to look as it's being implemented and reform is starting to take shape over the course of the next few years?
Yeah, I don't know exactly what it would look like, but I do think what we would see is, because of this pervasive distrust of the police, right? And because so many communities, quite frankly, feel like the police is a government funded gang, right?
Right.
And that's terrifying, particularly for folks in Black and Brown communities, not only in Black and Brown communities, but in underserved communities in general. What we'll see is like, and we talked about this before when we were talking about the protests, we're seeing like this over militarization of the police, right? When police show up at protests, they are in full like gear, like bulletproof vest, SWAT uniform. And it was so difficult to watch that in juxtaposition with health care workers who couldn't even get access to N95 masks, right?
Right.
So what we're seeing is that our priorities have like really shifted as a society, in that we can't even find that frontline workers who are saving people's lives can get access to the resources that they need, but police officers can. We're finding that public schools are being defunded in many cities, but that money is going into police departments. So, I think a lot of people, when we say defund the police, I think people think that it means it's going to be chaos. What that actually means is that money can go into different aspects of public society that are absolutely necessary. We could go into,
Mm-hmm.
areas like education. We could go into areas like public health care. Could go into areas, like communities that need this funding. And so I think that people don't really understand that. People are not really connecting the dots. People think that it just means crime will be rampant, but what we're not, and this is about our society, is that we felt that if you over police, you will then maintain order. When really, if you put resources and energy into these other aspects of society, like education, then you'll actually then see a decrease in crime. And so I think
Right.
it's a powerful it's a powerful tool for Trump to kind of double down on this fear, because he is certainly appealing to an audience of people who are just going to say, well, folks are going to run rampant and there's going to be crime, rather than understanding that if you actually put this money into other parts of society, it will in fact decrease crime.
Right. And what I've taken note of or started to think about is there seems to be a very real philosophical and generational divide when it comes to the role of police in society and the way that they themselves view their role in society. And what I mean when I say that is, in the Nixon era, in the Reagan era, even in the Bill Clinton era, and moving on into modern day with the George Bush presidency as well, we were in a war on drugs. We were in a war on crime. We were in a war on terror. And the cops that we hired and employed and charged with keeping our city safe and cleaning up our streets viewed themselves as warriors in a war on something. And instead of being those who protect and serve, instead of being guardians of safety, they were warriors against crime, against drugs, against terror. And that's what you see when you start to protest them, is that there are warriors standing on a battlefield who are standing in direct opposition to people who are protesting their very presence in their cities. So what kind of a
Yeah.
message does that send to cops who are being charged with keeping the peace, who are being charged with allowing these individuals to demonstrate peacefully, they're not there to keep the peace. They are there to execute their will against their opposition. They're warriors, right? How does that sit
Absolutely.
with you?
I think you make a fantastic point there. And it is something that I hadn't really given a lot of thought about when we think about this generational divide, right? We so often think that the police kind of all of them think the same way, right? Again, kind of going back to this idea that it is a gang mentality, and that it's kind of like this is the way it is. But I think you're absolutely right in that there are officers that have a different idea of what policing is. And that is not separate from the context of what policing has been in this country. We talked a lot about, just the origins of police in this country and police departments really being rooted in slave patrols. And you're absolutely right. As we progress through history of this idea of fighting a war on crime and fighting a war on drugs, there are quite certainly, in the same way that we have a generation of segregationalists in this country, we
Right.
do have a segregation of officers. Excuse me, we do have a generation of officers who believe that it is their duty to, sort of act as war generals or as soldiers. And I do think that we see that play out so often in some of these horrific videos that we've seen. And then on the flip side, we see that play out with this younger generation or a different generation of officers who are actually engaging with the community in different ways, right? The question then is, Lee, how do we empower that generation of officers? How do we shift the idea of policing in this country in order to elevate and give a platform to those types of officers and not necessarily to the ones who see themselves as warriors, so to speak?
And what I think we all need to be acutely aware of and have our eye out, looking out for the fact that when and if defunding does come into practice, my real concern is that the community policing efforts and all of those retraining programs are going to be the things that are defunded first, instead of the militarized vehicles and the weapons that are, the means of excessive violence. I'm really concerned that we're going to see less body cams, less retraining, and we're going to see the same amount of over-militarized policing tools, and this problem really won't go away. It may actually even be made worse.
Again, I think you make a really, really great point, right? And I think one of the things that we've got to do is we've got to use research. We've got to be able to prove that militarization or more cops does not mean less crime. Going back to what I said about where these priorities are going, I think that we, for so long, because of the way we've thought about policing in this country, we've made the assumption that as long as you have cops with guns on the corner, it means crime is not going to happen. Without understanding the tensions that are being created, the tensions that have already existed in communities. And so I think what is going to be really imperative when we talk about defunding the police is making sure that we have concrete information, that we have research, that we can actually point to case studies, that we can point to information that says, if we do this, we will actually see a decrease in crime. What we saw with stop and frisk that was so horrific was this assumption that if you stopped crime at the petty level, if you got like to a petty criminal, that you were somehow going to avoid more serious crimes down the road, And to your point, New York going from being an incredibly dangerous city in the 70s and 80s is now known as one of the largest and safest cities in the country compared to where it's come from. And that's so much of where that stop and frisk rhetoric came from. But we then found that stop and frisk contributed to some incredibly disturbing issues, most notably with Khalif Browder. You found these young Black and brown men being put in jail for these petty crimes, and it was contributing to a much larger issue within the prison industrial complex. So we really need hard research and actual facts that are going to reinforce this issue, that it's not going to help us to get rid of body cams. That's not what we need.
Right.
It's not going to help us to get rid of community programs. That's not what we need. And I think that there are going to be people, to your point, who are reticent to, cops included, who are reticent to get rid of the things like, military resources, and who will be more willing to say, well, the body cams can go and the community resources can go, and we're going to need some serious research to combat that in order to make sure that that doesn't happen.
Yeah, I think in this moment, moving forward, it's going to be, we will have to do the work, the public, we will have to do the work of continuing to hold our elected officials accountable. It is not enough to just vote once, twice a year, or once every 4 years and then throw your hands up if this keeps happening. Right. We can't just protest, and we can't drop the ball after going to the polls. It is going to take a consistent and calculated effort to control the narrative and demand transparency moving forward if we are going to see new change. Because I think we are in a very new civil rights era in this country. We are in the early days of what could be a radical shift in America moving forward. But, as you pointed out, we're going to have to do the work to make sure that the change that we want to see is actually the change that we get.
Absolutely. I agree with you wholeheartedly. I mean, I think we're really going to have to, we're going to have to rethink, what does holding our elected officials even look like, right?
Right.
I think, to a certain extent, there is this idea that you get elected and you're kind of able to do whatever you want, particularly if you've already won as an incumbent, or you're not going to be, pursuing political office again. I do think that we might need some checks and balances of, like, how do we make sure that folks we vote into office are actually are keeping the promises and making good on the promises that they made. Right. I think we've got to really think about that as we think about, I think we've spent a lot of time talking about how do we reframe our ideas of policing. We've got to think about how we reframe our ideas of politics as well. Again, going back to lifetime appointments for judges, that affects a lot as far as the legislative level. And as we think more about the prison industrial complex, a lot of these precedents, the precedent that is set in the courtroom, that's set by folks that don't have to worry about their constituents. They don't have to worry about making anybody happy or being held accountable. So, I think that's another conversation that we have to have, is how do we kind of shift accountability in this country moving forward?
I couldn't agree more. And I think we are coming up on our time in this live stream. Danielle, thank you so much for being here and for taking the time out of your afternoon for another great conversation. Is there anything else you want to leave the audience with, or anything we should think about coming into this week, looking at the headlines? I mean, we're seeing, fireworks littering the sky, and it's not July 4th quite yet. Protests haven't ended, but they have gotten smaller to a certain extent. What should we be thinking about in the days to come this week?
I think as we go into next week being a holiday, and I think we see this naturally, right, with the news, is that things start to shift, right? Like we start to our attentions, we have short attention spans, particularly in media. And so I think we've got to think about, like, what's the next step here? We definitely started with a lot of momentum, and we started with a lot of conversation and a lot of coverage. And I think we've got to ask ourselves, where do we go from here? I think, former President Obama, very early on in this conversation said, I think we've got to think about the long game. We have to understand that this is a marathon and not a race. And not a sprint. This is going to take a long time. And, it is going to to a certain extent, it will fade a little bit in the news, and it might not be, it might go to one or two segments rather than an entire show. But I think we have to think about, even as that happens, what do we now do, to get to this next step? And I think just this conversation is exactly, kind of an exploration of that. Is we really have to dig deep on some of the scary strategies like voter suppression that could walk back a lot of the work that's been done. And, it would be a huge disservice to the members of the movement, to the activists, to the folks on the front lines, if we don't, if we don't put in work for this to be, for there to be a long-term solution here. This can't be a short fight, and we've all got to buckle in for this to take a long time.
Yeah, if we don't show up literally and figuratively, unfortunately, this will be an interesting footnote in American history, but it won't be the beginning of a new chapter. Thank you to everyone who tuned in this afternoon. We appreciate you. Stay safe, stay healthy. Danielle, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Lee.
And we'll see you next time.